Harlem, New York. The year is 1924. Stop for a moment. Close your eyes. I want you to hear the pulse of this street. It isn't the sound of jazz drifting muffled from the cellars of the Cotton Club, where white people go to watch black people dance. It isn't the sound of patent leather shoes tapping on the sidewalk under the gas lamps. It isn't the easy laughter of those celebrating the Harlem Renaissance. If you listen closely, underneath the music, the poetry, and the joy, you will hear something else. It is a mechanical sound, rhythmic, constant. It is the sound of money, dirty money, fast money, cash money, paper brushing against paper, coins clinking in burlap sacks. Harlem isn't just a cultural neighborhood. It is an independent financial kingdom. It is an island within an island. And in this kingdom, the throne does not belong to a man. It does not belong to an elected politician. And certainly, it does not belong to a white man from Lower Manhattan. The throne belongs to a shadow that shines. Imagine a woman. The year is 1924, but she seems to come from the future. She steps out of a black Duesenberg, a car with an engine that roars like a caged wild animal, a vehicle that costs more than most houses on that block. The chauffeur, in uniform, opens the door with a reverence that cannot be bought, only earned. First, you'll see the shoe. High heel, Italian leather, immaculate. Then she emerges. She is Tao. Her posture is that of a bronze statue, forged to look down on the world. Her skin is dark, flawless, glowing under the city lights. She wears a beaver fur coat that touches the ground, heavy, luxurious, an armor against the cold and against the mediocrity of the world. On her neck, real pearls. On her hands, white silk gloves that never, ever touch anything dirty. She speaks to a newspaper boy, and the accent is not American. It is French, musical, arrogant, exotic, a dangerous melody that disarms men before destroying them. Her name is Stephanie St. Clair, but on the streets, no one calls her Stephanie. That would be too much intimacy. That would be an insult. They call her Madame. They know that that cultured woman who quotes French poetry and lives in a luxury apartment is the most dangerous banker in New York. They said a woman couldn't lead men in a world of violence. She led an army. They said a black woman couldn't have money in a segregated country. She had more liquid cash in her vaults than the white banks that refused her entry through the front door. They said you couldn't fight the mafia, that you couldn't say no to men like Lucky Luciano or Al Capone, that it was an immediate death sentence. Queenie St. Clair looked at the mafia. She looked at the barrels of the Tommy guns. She looked at the psychopath named Dutch Schultz, the man who killed Weil Laffin, the man who made other gangsters tremble. And she didn't blink. She lit a cigarette, exhaled the smoke in Fate's face, and said, "Come and get it." Lucky Luciano, the architect of modern, organized crime. The man who restructured the American mafia was afraid of few things in this world. He feared syphilis. He feared Alcatraz federal prison. And he feared the woman who lived at 409 Edgecombe Avenue. This is the untold story of how a Caribbean immigrant, alone, declared war on the most violent crime syndicate in America and won. To understand the war, we first need to understand the prize. We need to understand what was at stake. Stephanie St. Clair did not arrive in America as a victim. She arrived coming from the French islands, Guadeloupe or Martinique. Legends vary, and she made a point of keeping the mystery in 1912. She saw the Statue of Liberty in the harbor, just like millions of others. But, unlike the others, she knew that the torch of that statue did not shine for people of her color. She knew that America was a promise broken before it was even made. She knew that freedom in this country had a price tag. In the first years, she did what was expected. Worked as a domestic servant, scrubbed white people's toilets, scrubbed floors on her knees, endured the stares, the insults, the invisibility. But while she scrubbed, she watched. She listened to the boss's conversations. She saw how money moved America. She realized that, in this country, the only color that really mattered wasn't white or black. It was green. And she noticed a monumental flaw in the financial system. In Harlem, blacks couldn't get loans. White banks, legal and respectable, refused to lend money to blacks to buy houses, to open businesses, or even for medical emergencies. The system segregated capital. The community needed a bank. The community needed credit. The community needed hope. Stephanie decided to be that bank, but not a legal bank with revolving doors and business hours. She created the numbers game. It was an illegal lottery based on the last digits of stock exchange transactions or horse races. People bet pennies, a nickel, a dime, a quarter on a 3-digit number. If they hit, they won 600 times the bet amount. For a factory worker or a laundress, hitting the number meant paying a year's rent. It meant buying a new suit. It meant dignity. It was Harlem's financial blood, and Queenie was the heart pumping that blood. But Queenie wasn't just a corner bookie. She was a mathematical and organizational genius. She realized that most game bankers were deceived. They stole from winners, ran away when the prize was high, manipulated the numbers. She did something revolutionary. She was honest. She always paid, without fail. If someone won, Queenie paid. That bought her the absolute loyalty of the people. She became more trustworthy than the government. In 1923, she no longer scrubbed floors. Those hands no longer touched bleach. She managed a corporation. She had dozens of runners, fast messengers who collected bets in barbershops, beauty salons, churches, and corners. Money flowed into her apartment like a river in the rainy season. She grossed $250,000 a year. Istapi. To think, $250,000 in 1923. Adjusted for inflation, that's millions of dollars today. Cash money. Tax-free. Invisible to the IRS. She didn't hide the wealth under the mattress. She bought apartment buildings in Harlem, becoming a landlady. She financed local black newspapers. She paid expensive lawyers to defend young black men caught in the racist justice system. She became the godmother of Harlem, and she made a point of showing her power. She placed ads in newspapers denouncing police brutality, signing with her own name. She walked with her head held high, challenging white supremacy with every clicking step of her high heels. She was untouchable. She was living proof that the system could be beaten. But success has a smell, and that smell attracts sharks. During the 20s, Prohibition kept the Italian and Jewish mafia busy. Gangsters like Lucky Luciano, Al Capone, and Dutch Schultz were too busy smuggling rum, distilling whiskey, and running speakeasies. to worry about Harlem's penny bets. They made millions with alcohol. They considered the numbers game as nigger change, not worth the effort. They left Harlem alone. Harlem was Queenie's private playground. But then, ... The calendar turned. History turned the page. The Great Depression arrived in 1929, destroying the economy, and in 1933, Prohibition ended. Suddenly, alcohol became legal. Anyone could buy beer at the supermarket. The mafia's easy profit vanished overnight. Profit margins evaporated. Gangsters needed a new source of liquid income. They needed fast money to maintain their lifestyles and pay their soldiers. They looked at the map of New York. Their eyes turned to the north of Manhattan Island. They saw Harlem. They saw the numbers, money. They saw the pile of cash Queenie had built. They saw a black woman, an immigrant, controlling it all. And they thought, this is going to be easy. They thought they could simply walk in, slap her fascie, show a gun, and take the business. They were wrong. They made the classic mistake of arrogant predators. They didn't know they weren't dealing with a common criminal. They weren't dealing with a victim. They were dealing with a queen who had built her throne on the bones of her own survival. They were wrong. They made the classic mistake of arrogant predators. They didn't know they weren't dealing with a common criminal. They weren't dealing with a victim. They were dealing with a queen who had built her throne on the bones of her own survival. I want to ask you a question. Has anyone ever looked at something you built, your work, your reputation, your little empire, and thought they could simply take it because they felt superior? Have you ever felt the cold, icy rage of being underestimated because of who you are, where you come from, or your appearance? If you know what it is to have to defend your territory against giants who think you are small, smash the like button. Now, let's show the algorithm and the world that we respect those who don't bow their heads, who plant their feet and say no. The enemy had a name, and it was a name that made grown men wet themselves with fear. Achtung Flegienimer, but the criminal world knew him as Dutch Schul, the Dutchman. He wasn't an elegant mobster like Lucky Luciano, who wore silk suits and spoke softly. Schultz was a rabid animal, a mad dog with a gun in his hand, a functional psychopath. He wore cheap, ill-fitting suits because he didn't care about appearance, only power. He chewed wet, cheap cigars. He was famous for killing his own men over minor accounting errors. He beat debtors to death with his bare hands. He was the beer baron of the Bronx, the king of gratuitous violence. And now he wanted Harlem. 1931, Dutch Schultz begins the invasion. His tactic isn't subtle. It isn't negotiation. It is pure terrorism. Schultz's men, armed with baseball bats and revolvers, begin beating Queenie's runners on the streets. They enter tobacco shops, laundromats, and barber shops, where bets were collected. They break glass, break counters, break teeth, break fingers. The message is simple and brutal. From today on, you work for the Dutchman. The bets are ours, or you die. Panic spreads through Harlem. Most independent black bankers caved immediately. The fear was real. Schultz didn't just have guns. He had the New York police in his pocket. He had judges on the payroll. He had politicians. They were small black business owners against an industrial death machine backed by the state. One by one, they handed their businesses over to Schultz. They accepted becoming employees in their own empire, receiving crumbs of what was once their banquet. Everyone caved, except one. Schultz realized there was an obstacle. The woman on Edgecombe Avenue. He decides to be diplomatico in his twisted way. He sends a messenger to Queenie's luxury apartment. The proposal was an insult. She could continue managing the business, use her influence, but hand over 70% of the profits to Schultz and accept his protection. Basically, she became a glorified manager. The scene is legendary. Queenie receives the messenger in her living room. The apartment is a museum of good taste. French furniture, Persian rugs, expensive art on the walls. She is sitting in her armchair, drinking tea from a fine porcelain cup. She doesn't even offer him a glass of water, nor does she invite him to sit. The messenger, a mobster used to intimidating strong men, feels small before her. She looks at him with absolute disdain, as if he were mud on the sole of her shoe. She puts the cup down slowly. The sound of porcelain against the saucer echoes in the silent room. "Tell Mr. Schultz," she says, with a thick accent, every word sharp as a blade, "that I have no partners. I don't need protection from anyone except men like him. And, definitely, I do not associate with rats that smell of cheap beer and desperation." The response was a declaration of nuclear war. When the messenger conveyed the words to Schultz, he turned purple with rage. He threw bottles at the wall. "That nigger bitch is going to die," he shouted. "I'm going to fill that fur coat with lead." He put a contract on her head, a reward for whoever killed her. He sent his hitman after her. He thought she would panic, that she would pack her bags, grab her jewelry, and flee to the Caribbean on the first ship. But Queenie St. Clair didn't pack bags. She went to the closet, took out the hat boxers, and inside there were no hats. There was ammunition. She bought guns and prepared to defend her castle. Queenie wasn't stupid. She knew she couldn't beat Schultz in an open shootout in the middle of the street. He had hundreds of soldiers. She had dozens. He had the police. She was the target of the police. If she tried to fight force against force, she would be crushed in days. So she did what history's great generals always did when outnumbered. She changed the rules of the game. She started an urban guerrilla war, an asymmetric war. First, she used intelligence. Queenie knew Harlem. Schultz didn't. For Schultz, Harlem was a maze of hostile faces. For Queenie, it was her living room. She knew who slept with whom, knew which alleys had exits and which didn't, knew which basements had secret tunnels. She used the community as her eyes and ears. When Schultz's black cars crossed 110th Street to enter Harlem, the phones rang. Children ran through the streets, warning. Old women in windows made signs. It was an impossible spy network to penetrate. When Schultz's hitmen arrived at the betting places, breaking down doors, they found empty rooms. The money was already gone. The ledgers had vanished. Only cigar smoke remained. But she also needed violence. She needed a sword. She needed a field general, someone who was as violent as Schultz, but loyal to her to the death. She found Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Today, Bumpy is a legend, portrayed in movies and series, but back then he was just a smart, cultured ex-con, a man who read Shakespeare and Nietzsche in his cell, and lethal, who always carried a short-blade knife and a sawed-off shotgun. Queenie saw the potential in him, saw the warrior. She hired him as her bodyguard and head of security. The dynamic was perfect. Queenie was the brain, the aristocracy, the strategy, the diplomacy. Bumpy was the muscle, the street, the execution, the terror. Bumpy Johnson organized the armed resistance. They didn't wait to be attacked. They attacked. They started hunting Schultz's men who ventured into Harlem at night. Bodies of Italian and Jewish mobsters started appearing, floating in the Harlem River at dawn. The message was clear. Not here. Finally, she used psychological warfare. Because Queenie's true weapon of mass destruction wasn't Bumpy's knife. It was her typewriter. Queenie St. Clair did something no gangster in history ever had the courage to do. She reported the police to the police themselves. She knew Schultz paid massive bribes to the New York police to turn a blind eye to his violence and to arrest her men. The police were Schultz's armed wing, so she documented everything. She had spies inside the police force. She noted badge numbers, noted dates, noted exact bribe amounts, delivery locations, and she started publishing paid ads in Harlem's black newspapers, entire columns signed by her, with bold headlines. The truth about the local police. She exposed corruption publicly, with forensic detail. Officer X from Precinct Y received $500 on such day to beat an innocent man on 125th Street. This was suicidal. She was attacking the mafia and the law at the same time. She was declaring war on the entire system. The retaliation was fierce. The police, humiliated and exposed, raided her house, not once, repeatedly. They arrested her, dragged her to the precinct by her hair. One time, they falsely accused her of shooting a corrupt officer. She went to prison. In the cold, damp cell, they tried to break her, tried to humiliate her, took away her expensive clothes, gloves, dignity, called her every racist name in the book. They expected to see her cry, expected to see her beg. But when she came out stronger, came out angrier. She testified before the Seabury Commission, a government commission investigating corruption in New York. She sat in the witness chair, dressed up, impeccable, and named names. She opened the books. The result was an earthquake. Dozens of police officers were fired, suspended, or arrested because of Queenie's notes. Judges were investigated. She cut off Dutch Schultz's police protection. She left the monster exposed, without the shield of the law. The war lasted years. Harlem became an open combat zone. There was no peace. Shootings in broad daylight, cars passing by and firing machine guns into shop windows. Homemade bombs. Schultz was losing money, was losing men, and was losing patience. His obsession with Queenie became personal. He increased the pressure, doubled the reward on her head. He wanted Queenie dead. Whatever the cost, there was a dark period where Queenie had to live like a rat to survive like a queen. She couldn't go back to her luxury apartment. It was too easy a target. She had to hide. Legends say she spent weeks hiding in a coal cellar of a building in Harlem. Imagine the visual and sensory contrast. The woman who wore furs, silks, and pearls, now covered in black coal dust in the dark. Hearing the footsteps of Schultz's hitman on the sidewalk above her head, eating cold canned food, sleeping on burlap sacks. The smell of mold, the cold, the loneliness. Anyone else would have fled, would have caught a train to Canada. But she didn't leave Harlem. She refused to abandon her people and her territory. She continued managing the game from the shadows, sending orders through Bumpy Johnson. "I stay here," she told Bumpy, wiping soot from her face. "This is my ground, and no one takes me off my ground." Meanwhile, Dutch Schultz's madness was becoming a radioactive problem for the mafia itself. Lucky Luciano and Meyerlansky, the heads of the commission, the governing council managing national organized crime, were worried. Schultz was bringing too much heat. The constant press attention, the endless war in Harlem, the investigations by Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey. All of that was bad for business. The mafia liked silence and profit, not war and headlines. Schultz, desperate and cornered by tax investigations, thanks in part to the noise Queenie made, had a crazy idea, he told the commission. "I'm going to kill Prosecutor Thomas Dewey," Luciano said. "No. Are you crazy? Killing a federal prosecutor would bring the army and the FBI down on us. It would be the end of the mafia." Schultz's eyes glazed with rage, slammed the table, and said he would do it anyway, with or without their permission. By signing that sentence, Schultz signed his own death warrant. The mafia decided the Dutchman had to go. He had become a rabid dog that needed to be put down. October 23rd, 1935. Newark, New Jersey. Palace Chop House Restaurant. It is night. The restaurant is calm. Dutch Schultz is in the bathroom, washing his hands, looking at himself in the mirror, perhaps thinking about his plan to kill Dewey. The door opens. It isn't Queenie's man. It is the hitman of Murder, Inc., the mafia's armed wing, sent by Lucky Luciano. Charles the Bug Workman enters with a .38 special pistol. He says nothing. He fires. A rusty bullet. They say they used rusty bullets to cause gangrene. If the target survived, hits Schultz in the abdomen, perforating vital organs. His bodyguards are gunned down in the main hall in a hail of bullets. But Schultz doesn't die immediately. Fate wanted him to suffer. He is taken to the hospital, bleeding, in agony. He agonizes for over 20 hours, delirious with infection fever, murmuring senseless, poetic, and terrifying phrases that were transcribed by a police stenographer. He is dying in excruciating pain, friendless, betrayed by his own. In Harlem, the news spreads like electricity. They shot the Dutchman. Queenie St. Clair hears her mortal enemy is on his death. She could have opened champagne. She could have thrown a street party. But Queenie had style. She had class. She operated on another level, and she wanted to have the last word. She wanted to ensure Schultz's last thought was about her. She grabs a fountain pen, grabs a Western Union telegram form, and writes. She sends the telegram directly to the hospital, to Dutch Schultz's bedside. While he was dying, between life and death, he received the message. The text was short, a biblical quote, distorted by the supreme irony of a winner who survived the monster. It read simply as the sow, so shall the reap. Signed, Madame Queenie. It was the ultimate mic drop in organized crime history. She didn't fire the bullet. She didn't soil her white gloves with blood. But she buried him with words. She reminded him, in his last breath, that all the evil he had done had come back to him. Schultz died shortly after. Queenie lived with Schultz's dead. The war ended. The Italian mafia, led by Luciano and Genovese, took control of gambling operations in Harlem. They were too big to be stopped. Luciano made a deal with Bumpy Johnson, allowing him to manage local operations in exchange for a slice of the profits. But Queenie, what happened to the Queen? Queenie was smart. She knew when to leave the table. She realized the era of independent bankers was over. The era of crime corporations had begun. The game had changed. She refused to submit to Luciano. She refused to be an employee. So she did the unthinkable for a gangster. She reformed. She took her millions, took her buildings, and left the game. She didn't end up dead in a ditch with a bullet in her head. She didn't end up in life imprisonment like Al Capone. She lived and lived well. She dedicated the rest of her life to fighting for civil rights and social reform. She wrote columns for newspapers defending the black community. She married, ironically, a police sergeant. Perhaps her final joke against the law. She continued to live in her luxury apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, wearing her furs, strolling through Harlem like the royalty. She was untouchable, respected, feared. She died in 1969, in her bed, old, rich, and free. A few months before dying, it is said she looked out the window at the changing Harlem, at the young people marching for civil rights, and said, "They tried to take everything from me, tried to kill me, but they forgot one thing. I didn't come to America to ask for permission. I came to take what was mine." Stephanie St. Clair is not just a crime story. It is not just a story of gangsters and gunfire. It is a story of resistance. In a world that said the black woman should be invisible, silent, and servile, she made a point of being the brightest, loudest, richest, and most dangerous thing in the room. She looked the devil in the eye, be it the mafia, the police, or racism, and made him blink first. Now, I ask you, looking at your own life, how many times did you back down because someone told you you could How many times did you accept less than you deserved because you were afraid of confrontation, afraid of seeming difficult? Queenie St. Clair teaches us a brutal but necessary lesson for those who want to win. No one gives you power. The world doesn't distribute power out of charity. You have to take it. You have to defend it. If you feel you have an empire inside you, waiting to be built, if you refuse to be intimidated by those who think they are bigger, stronger, or more legitimate, write your declaration of war in the comments now. I do not back down. Share this story. The world needs to know that. Before the Godfathers, before Tony Soprano, before Michael Corleone, there was a queen. Subscribe for more stories history tried to erase. Aute.